The boy was crying before they reached the village. It was not the dramatic performative crying of a child who wanted something and had learned that volume was currency. It was the quiet, exhausted crying of a 4-year-old who had been in a carriage for 6 hours and who wanted his nursemaid and his wooden horse and the particular corner of the nursery at Ashcombe where the light came through the curtains in the afternoon and made patterns on the floor that he called his tigers. Robert did not travel well. He had not traveled well since his mother died, which was 18 months ago, and which had changed everything about the boy, his sleep, his appetite, his willingness to be held by anyone other than Mrs. Brennan, who had been his nursemaid since birth, and who was, at this moment, sitting in the second carriage with a headache and the expression that suggested she held the Duke personally responsible for the entire expedition. Charles Montfort, 4th Duke of Ashcombe, held his son on his lap and said for the 3rd time, "We are almost there. I want to go home. I know. I want Mrs. Brennan. She is just behind us. I want my tigers." Charles closed his eyes. The tigers. The light through the nursery curtains. He had spent 18 months trying to hold his son's world together, the routines, the rituals, the small certainties that Elizabeth had built around the boy like a fortress made of habit and warmth, and he had failed at most of them. He could not make the light come through the curtains at the right angle. He could not hold Robert the way Elizabeth had held him, with the boy's head tucked beneath her chin and her hand on his back moving in the slow circles that meant safety. He could not be his mother. He could only be his father, and his father was a man who had spent the past 18 months discovering that competence in the House of Lords and competence in a nursery were entirely different skills, and that he possessed only one of them. The carriage turned off the main road and onto a lane bordered by hedgerows. They were in Hertfordshire, 30 miles from London, a world away from the noise and performance of the season, and they were here because Lord Granville, who was Charles's oldest friend, and who had watched him deteriorate since Elizabeth's death with the quiet alarm of a man who could see the damage but not the remedy, had written a letter. The letter had said, "There is a family near my estate, the Fieldings, a gentleman of modest means, a wife and a daughter, Anne, who is 24 and unmarried. She is not what London would consider remarkable. She is what I would consider exactly what you need. Come and see for yourself. But Charles, do not come as the Duke. Come as yourself. Come as a father with a boy who needs something you cannot give him. If she is right, you will know. If she is not, you will have lost nothing but a weekend." Charles had resisted. He had resisted for 3 weeks, during which Robert had stopped eating breakfast. Mrs. Brennan had threatened to resign for the 4th time, and the new governess, the 3rd in a year, had lasted exactly 9 days before declaring that the child was unmanageable and the household was in chaos, and she had not trained at Mrs. Langford's academy to be ignored by a 4-year-old who would only speak to his nursemaid. On the 10th day, Charles had written back to Granville, "We will come. I will use my family name only. Introduce me as Mr. Montfort, a friend from London. Do not mention the title, the estate, or the House of Lords. If this woman is kind, I want to see it directed at my son, not at my position." They arrived at Granville's estate, a comfortable manor called Whitwell, at 4:30 on a Friday afternoon. Robert had stopped crying, but had replaced it with a silence that Charles found more alarming, the silence of a child who has retreated into himself because the world outside has become too unpredictable to trust. Granville met them in the drive. He was 56, unmarried, possessed of the particular warmth that some childless men develop toward the children of their friends. And he crouched down to Robert's height and said, "I have a dog. His name is Captain. He's very old and very fat, and he sleeps in front of the fire. Would you like to meet him?" Robert looked at his father. Charles nodded. Robert took Granville's hand, cautiously with the careful grip of a child who had learned that hands could be withdrawn without warning, and they went inside. Charles stood in the drive and breathed. The air smelled of cut grass and horse, and something floral he could not identify, and the house was quiet in the way that only country houses are quiet, with the particular hum of a place that exists at a pace London has forgotten. The Fieldings were invited to dinner the following evening. Granville had arranged it with the casual precision of a man who understood that the arrangement must appear accidental to succeed. "The Fieldings are neighbors," he told Charles over breakfast. "They dine with me regularly. Anne helps with the parish school. Her father reads too much, and her mother worries too much, and Anne manages both of them with a competence that I find, frankly, intimidating." "You admire her." "I admire anyone who runs a household on £200 a year without complaint and teaches 12 children to read without losing her patience or her mind. She is," Granville paused, searching for the word. "She is the kind of woman who enters a room and makes it work better. Not louder, not brighter, better." Charles said nothing. He was thinking about Elizabeth, who had entered rooms and made them beautiful, who had been admired by everyone and loved by him, and who had died of a fever in November with Robert sleeping in the next room, and who had left behind a house that functioned perfectly and a husband who did not. The Fieldings arrived at 6 o'clock on Saturday evening. Mr. Fielding was a retired clergyman with spectacles and a distracted manner that suggested he was always thinking about something other than what was happening in front of him. Mrs. Fielding was anxious and talkative, and immediately began complimenting the curtains and the silver and the arrangement of the dining table, which Charles recognized as the nervous performance of a woman who felt out of place and was filling the silence with words before it could fill itself with judgment. Anne Fielding was neither of these things. She was 24, dark-haired, of medium height, and dressed in a green muslin day gown that was clean and well pressed, but had been turned at the cuffs, a detail that Charles noticed because Elizabeth had taught him to notice such things, and because noticing was easier than feeling, and he had spent 18 months choosing the former over the latter. Her face was pleasant without being striking. Her manner was composed without being rigid. She greeted Granville with the easy warmth of genuine friendship, greeted Charles with a polite inclination of her head and a handshake that was firm and brief, and when Granville introduced him as "my friend Mr. Montford, visiting from London with his young son," she said, "How do you do, Mr. Montford? How old is your son?" 4. "Is he with you this evening?" "He is upstairs with his nursemaid." He's not comfortable in new places." Anne looked at him. It was a brief look, 2 seconds, perhaps 3, but it contained a quality that Charles had not encountered since Elizabeth's death, the recognition of a thing unsaid. She heard what he had not told her, that the boy was not merely uncomfortable but afraid, not merely shy but wounded, and she heard it without him having to say it. "New places are difficult," she said, "especially for children who have lost something familiar." Charles stared at her. "Granville told you." "Lord Granville told me nothing. But you said his nursemaid, not his mother, and a father who travels with a nursemaid and explains that his son is not comfortable in new places is a father who has been managing alone. I am sorry for your loss, Mr. Montford." She said it simply, without the performed sympathy that Charles had endured from 100 drawing rooms, the tilted heads, the softened voices, the hands placed on his arm by women who were already calculating whether his grief made him more or less eligible. Anne Fielding said, "I am sorry for your loss," the way one states a fact, with respect for its weight and no attempt to carry it for him. Dinner was served. Charles sat beside Mrs. Fielding, who talked about the difficulty of finding good help in the country and the price of sugar and the shocking state of the roads between Hertfordshire and London. Anne sat across from him, beside Granville, and Charles watched her the way he had learned to watch people in the House of Lords, not their words but their manner, not what they said but what they did with their hands and their eyes and the spaces between their sentences. She listened to Granville with genuine attention. She redirected her mother gently when Mrs. Fielding's anxiety tipped into repetition. She asked Mr. Fielding about the book he was reading, A History of the Early Church, and received his answer with the patient interest of a woman who had heard about the early church many times before and valued her father's enthusiasm more than the subject. She ate neatly, drank moderately, and at no point attempted to perform anything for anyone. After dinner, while the adults took coffee in the drawing room, Charles excused himself. He went upstairs to the nursery, a guest room that Granville had hastily converted with a small bed and a rug and the wooden horse that Mrs. Brennan had insisted on bringing, and found Robert awake, sitting on the floor with Captain the dog, who had somehow found his way upstairs and was lying beside the boy with the resigned tolerance of a very old animal who had given up pretending he did not enjoy company. "He came to find me," Robert said. He's a good judge of character. He smells. That is because he's old. Old things are allowed to smell. Robert almost smiled. It was not a smile. It was the preliminary tremor, the seismic precursor. But it was more than Charles had seen in weeks, and he sat on the floor beside his son and the ancient dog and felt something loosen in his chest that had been wound tight since November. The following morning, Charles came downstairs to find that Anne Fielding had returned. She was in the garden with Granville, discussing the parish school, something about slates and the cost of chalk and whether the older children could be taught to help the younger ones to free Anne for more advanced lessons. Charles watched from the morning room window. She spoke with her hands when she was passionate about something, small, precise gestures that punctuated her sentences like emphasis marks. And Granville listened with the indulgent attention of a man who had long ago decided that this woman was worth listening to. Robert appeared at his side. He was still in his nightclothes. Mrs. Brennan was upstairs preparing his things, and he pressed his face against the window and said, "Who is that?" "A friend of Lord Granville's, Miss Fielding. She's in the garden." "She is. Can I go to the garden?" Charles looked at his son. Robert had not asked to go anywhere voluntarily in months. He had been carried, led, coaxed, negotiated with, but he had not asked. "Put on your shoes," Charles said, "and your coat." Robert went outside. Charles watched from the window. He could not have said why he did not follow, except that something in the way Robert walked across the grass with the tentative purposefulness of a child approaching something he was not sure would welcome him, made Charles understand that his presence would change whatever was about to happen. He stayed. He watched. Robert approached Anne Fielding the way he approached everything since Elizabeth's death, slowly, sideways, ready to retreat. He stopped 3 feet from where she stood with Granville and looked at the ground. Anne noticed him. She did not exclaim. She did not crouch down with the exaggerated brightness that adults deployed around shy children, the performative warmth that Robert had learned to distrust because it was always followed by hands reaching for him and voices asking him questions he did not want to answer. She simply looked at him, and then she looked at the ground where he was looking, and she said, "There is a worm." Robert looked up. "Where?" "There, by your left shoe. He's quite large. I think he's lost." Robert crouched down. Anne crouched down beside him, not close enough to crowd him, not far enough to dismiss him, but at exactly the distance that a 4-year-old who did not trust new people needed in order to feel safe without feeling trapped. "He's going the wrong way," Robert said. "How can you tell?" "Because the earth is dry over there. Worms need wet earth. My mother told me." Charles, standing at the morning room window, stopped breathing. It was the first time Robert had mentioned Elizabeth voluntarily in 4 months. Anne did not react. She did not look up at Granville with significance. She did not say, "Your mother sounds very clever," with the weighted tenderness that adults used when referencing dead parents to their children. She said, "She was right. Shall we help him find the wet earth?" They spent 20 minutes in the garden, Anne and Robert and the worm, and eventually Captain, who lumbered out through the kitchen door and lay in the grass watching them with the philosophical indifference of a dog who had seen everything and found most of it acceptable. Robert showed Anne how to move a worm without hurting it. You had to wet your hands first. His mother had taught him that too. And Anne listened with the same attention she had given Granville's conversation at dinner, the same attention she gave her father's lectures on the early church, the attention of a woman for whom listening was not a skill but a disposition. Charles watched all of it. He watched his son speak more words in 20 minutes than he had spoken in the previous 3 days. He watched Anne's hands, careful, unhurried, following Robert's instructions about the worm with genuine interest rather than performed patience. He watched the moment when Robert, reaching for the worm, lost his balance, and Anne caught his arm, gently, without fuss, steadying him and releasing him in a single motion that communicated, "I am here without saying you need me." He watched his son look up at Anne Fielding with an expression he had not seen since Elizabeth's death. Trust. Charles left the window. He walked through the house, past the drawing room where Granville had laid out the morning papers, past the study where Mr. Fielding was already reading about the early church, past the kitchen where Mrs. Brennan was arguing with Granville's cook about porridge, and he went out to the garden. Anne stood when she saw him. Robert did not. He was placing the worm in a patch of damp earth near the fountain, and his attention was entirely occupied. "Mr. Montfort," Anne said, "your son has been teaching me about worms." "So I see. He is very knowledgeable. He tells me his mother was an expert. She was an expert on most things." Charles looked at Anne Fielding standing in the morning light in her green muslin gown with the turned cuffs and the grass stain on her hem where she had knelt beside his son, and he made a decision. Not a careful decision, not a calculated decision, not the kind of decision he made in the House of Lords after weighing evidence and consulting precedent. A decision made in the way his mother had once told him the important decisions were made, with the part of yourself that knows before the rest of you catches up. "Miss Fielding," he said, "I have not been entirely honest with you." Anne's expression shifted, not alarm, not suspicion, but the careful attention of a woman who understood that honesty was about to require something of her. "My name is Charles Montfort. That part is true, but I'm not merely Mr. Montfort. I'm the Duke of Ashcombe." The garden was very quiet. Robert continued placing the worm. Captain yawned. "I came here because Granville suggested I might find—" He stopped. The words he had prepared, the reasonable explanation about seeking a wife, about Robert needing a mother's presence, about the practical necessities of a household without a mistress, all of it felt suddenly insufficient, like trying to describe a cathedral by listing its measurements. "I came here because my son has not mentioned his mother voluntarily in 4 months," he said, "and in 20 minutes with you he mentioned her twice. He showed you how to hold a worm the way she taught him. He trusted you with something he has not trusted anyone with since she died, and I do not believe that was accidental. I believe that was the result of who you are, not what you performed, not what you calculated, not what you showed me, because you thought I was a duke. You did not know I was a duke. You knew I was a father with a boy who was hurting, and you got down on your knees in the grass, and you helped him move a worm." Anne looked at him. Then she looked at Robert. Then she looked back at Charles with an expression he could not entirely read. It contained surprise and something that might have been anger, and beneath both of those, something quieter and more complicated that he would later learn, was the particular emotion of a woman who had been seen clearly for the first time and was not yet sure whether it was safe. "You watched us," she said, "from the window." "Yes." "You watched to see how I would treat him without knowing who you were." "Yes. That is—" She paused. She was choosing her words with the same care she brought to everything. "That is either the most calculating thing a man has ever done to me, or the most honest. I have not yet decided which." "It is both," Charles said, "and I am sorry for the calculation, but I am not sorry for what it showed me." "And what did it show you?" "That you are kind without performance, that you listen without agenda, that my son, who has not willingly approached a stranger since his mother died, walked across a garden to stand beside you because something in you told him it was safe." He paused. "I would like to court you, Miss Fielding, properly, as myself, with full knowledge of who I am and what I am asking." Anne did not answer immediately. She looked at Robert, who had finished with the worm and was now sitting in the grass with Captain's head in his lap, stroking the old dog's ears with the absent tenderness of a child who had found, for the first time in months, something that did not require him to be careful. "I will consider it," she said, "but I have conditions." "Name them." "First, you will not test me again. If you wish to know something about my character, you will ask me directly, and I will tell you the truth, because that is what I do. Second, I am not a replacement for your wife. I did not know her. I cannot be her. If you are looking for someone to recreate what you had, I am not that person. I can only be what I am." "What are you?" "A clergyman's daughter who teaches children to read and knows how to hold a worm without hurting it. That is the whole of my qualifications." "Those," Charles said, "are precisely the qualifications I have been looking for." The courtship lasted 5 weeks. Charles visited every weekend, bringing Robert, who had begun asking on Wednesday mornings whether it was Friday yet. Anne received them in her parents' modest parlor, where Mr. Fielding read in his corner, and Mrs. Fielding brought tea and biscuits, and gradually stopped performing nervousness around the man she now knew was a duke, partly because Anne had told her to stop, and partly because Charles had a gift, inherited from Elizabeth, though he did not know it, for making people feel that their ordinary selves were sufficient. On the second visit, Anne took them to the parish school. It was a single room attached to the church, whitewashed walls, wooden benches, a blackboard that Anne had purchased with her own money because the parish could not afford one. 12 children between the ages of 5 and 11 sat in varying states of attention, while Anne moved between them with the calm authority of a woman who had been doing this long enough to know that discipline was not volume, but consistency. Robert stood in the doorway holding Charles's hand and watched. He watched Anne help a boy of 6 sound out words from a primer. He watched her settle a dispute between 2 girls over a shared slate with a fairness so swift and certain that both girls accepted the verdict without protest. He watched her crouch beside the youngest child, a girl of 5 with a stammer who could not get past the first syllable of her own name, and wait, without rushing, without finishing the word for her, until the girl said it herself, and then Anne said, "Perfect." Again, with a smile that contained no pity and no condescension, only the plain expectation that the girl could do it, and would. "I want to stay," Robert said. Charles looked down at his son. "You want to stay at the school?" "I want to sit at the bench. I can read. Mother taught me some words. I can show them." Charles looked at Anne across the room. She had heard. She pulled an empty bench to the end of the row and patted the seat, and Robert let go of his father's hand and walked across the schoolroom and sat down with the self-possession of a child who had found something that made sense to him. Charles sat at the back and watched his son learn beside 12 village children in a whitewashed room with a blackboard that a clergyman's daughter had bought with her own money. And he thought about the nursery at Ashcombe, the 3 governesses, the specially commissioned primers, the educational toys imported from Germany. And he understood that what Robert had needed was never the right materials. It was the right person. On the third visit, it rained. They sat in the Fieldings' parlor, and Anne read aloud, not to Robert specifically, but to the room, in the way that someone reads when reading aloud is a thing they do naturally, part of the texture of their life. She was reading Robinson Crusoe, and Robert sat on the rug at her feet with Captain, who now made the journey to the Fieldings whenever the Ashcombe carriage arrived at Whitwell, as though the dog had developed a social calendar, and listened with an absorption that Charles had not seen since the evenings when Elizabeth had read to him in the nursery. Charles sat in the armchair opposite Mr. Fielding, who was reading his own book and occasionally looking up with the mild surprise of a man who had forgotten there were other people in the room. Mrs. Fielding had gone to the kitchen. The rain fell against the windows. Anne's voice moved through the room with the steady, unhurried rhythm of someone who understood that the story was not a performance, but a gift, and that gifts were best given without flourish. Robert fell asleep. Anne stopped reading, marked the page, and covered him with a shawl from the back of her chair, a gesture so automatic, so devoid of deliberation, that Charles understood she had done it 100 times before, for the children at the school, for her father dozing in his chair, for anyone in her orbit who needed warmth and was not awake to ask for it. Anne and Robert built a world together during those visits. They collected stones from the garden and arranged them by color and size. They read books. She had strong opinions about which books were appropriate for a 4-year-old and dismissed 3 of Mrs. Brennan's choices with a firmness that made Mrs. Brennan, for the first time, look at the woman who might replace her mistress with something other than suspicion. They walked Captain, who had adopted Robert as his personal responsibility, and followed him with the devoted incompetence of a dog who was too old to keep up, but too stubborn to admit it. Charles watched, not from windows this time, he had promised, but from beside them, close enough to see the particular way Anne spoke to Robert, never down to him, never past him, always directly, as though his thoughts and feelings were as valid as anyone's in the room. She did not try to fix his grief. She did not tell him that his mother was watching from heaven, or that he should be brave, or that everything would be all right. She told him that missing someone was not a problem to be solved, but a feeling to be carried, and that carrying it did not mean carrying it alone. He proposed on the 5th Saturday. They were in the Fieldings' garden, a small, well-tended patch that Anne maintained herself, with herbs and climbing roses, and a bench where Mr. Fielding read when the weather was fine. Robert was inside with Mrs. Fielding, who was teaching him to make biscuits, a project that Mrs. Brennan had sanctioned with the grudging approval of a woman who recognized an ally when she saw one. "Anne," Charles said, "I would like to marry you." "I know. You know. Robert asked me on Wednesday whether I would come to live with him and Captain and the Tigers. I told him I would have to ask his father first. He said his father would say yes because, and I am quoting precisely, you make him less tired." Charles sat on the bench. He looked at the climbing roses. He thought about Elizabeth, who would have laughed at this, at the worm, at the biscuits, at their son's devastating honesty, and who would have said, with the certainty that had been her defining quality, that Anne Fielding was right. "You make me less tired," he said. "Robert is correct. I have conditions." "You always have conditions?" "Third condition, I will not replace the portrait of your first wife. She belongs in the house. Robert needs to see her." "I would never. I know you would not. But I am saying it aloud so that it is established, and so that no well-meaning aunt or housekeeper or visitor suggests otherwise in my presence. She was his mother. She will remain his mother. I will be, whatever I become to him. He will decide the word." Charles looked at this woman, this clergyman's daughter in a garden in Hertfordshire, with grass-stained hems and strong opinions about portraiture, and a 4-year-old boy who had walked across a lawn to stand beside her, because something in her told him it was safe. And he felt the knot in his chest that had been wound tight since November loosen another fraction. Not fully. Perhaps not ever fully. But enough. "Yes," he said, "to all of it." They married at Ashcombe in September. Anne arrived at the estate 3 days before the wedding, and Charles watched her walk through the house the way he had watched her walk through the garden, seeing everything, performing nothing. She met Mrs. Brennan properly, as an equal, and discussed Robert's routines with the thoroughness of a woman who understood that disrupting a child's rituals was the surest way to lose his trust. She met Cartwright the steward, and asked him 3 questions about the estate's income that he had not expected, and could not immediately answer. She stood before Elizabeth's portrait in the gallery, a painting in oils, Elizabeth in the blue dress she had worn to their wedding, smiling, and she looked at it for a long time without speaking. "She was beautiful," Anne said when Charles found her there. "She was. Robert has her eyes." "He does." Anne turned from the portrait and looked at him. "I will take care of what she built," she said. "I give you my word." The wedding was small. Granville stood as witness, weeping openly and without shame. Mr. and Mrs. Fielding sat in the front pew, Mrs. Fielding crying, and Mr. Fielding reading the order of service with the scholarly attention he brought to all texts. Robert stood beside his father in a small tailcoat that Mrs. Brennan had commissioned from the tailor in the village, and when the vicar asked whether anyone present knew of any impediment, Robert said, in a voice that carried to every corner of the chapel, "What is an impediment?" The congregation laughed. Anne laughed. Charles, for the first time since Elizabeth's funeral, laughed in a church. The months that followed were not the dramatic transformation that novels promised. They were quieter than that. Anne learned the house. She sat with Cartwright in the ledgers. She walked the estate with Mrs. Brennan and Robert and Captain, who had made the journey from Whitwell because Robert had refused to leave without him. And Granville, who had no children and therefore no practice refusing them, had surrendered the dog with the dignified defeat of a man outmaneuvered by a 4-year-old. She started a school. Not immediately. She spent the first month learning the estate, the tenants, the particular needs of a community that was larger and more complex than the parish she had left in Hertfordshire. But by October, she had identified a room above the estate's chapel that could serve, and she had written to every tenant family with children under 12, and she had purchased, with her own money, because she had not yet learned to think of Charles's money as hers, a blackboard and 24 slates and a set of primers. Charles found the receipt on her desk and brought it to her in the drawing room, where she was reading beside the fire with Robert asleep against her arm and Captain asleep at her feet. "You paid for this yourself," he said. "I did. With the money your father gave you at the wedding. It was the best use I could think of for it." He sat down beside her. "Anne, you are the Duchess of Ashcombe. The estate can afford slates. I know it can, but the school is mine. I built it. I want to know that I built it with something I earned, not something I married." She looked at him with the steady, undecorated honesty that had been the first thing he noticed about her and remained the thing he valued most. When the school is established and the children are learning and the tenants can see that it works, then I will ask you for funding. But I will ask with evidence, not with sentiment. You would expect no less from Cartwright. Cartwright does not sleep with my son on her arm. Cartwright has other virtues. He laughed. Mrs. Brennan, passing in the corridor, paused, not because the Duke's laughter was rare, though it had been, but because it had changed in quality since the wedding. It was warmer now, less surprised by itself. Robert began eating breakfast. He began sleeping through the night. He began slowly to call Anne by her name, not mother, not mama, but Anne, which she had told him was perfectly acceptable, and which Charles suspected was exactly right, because it was a word Robert had chosen for himself, rather than one that had been assigned to him. On a morning in December, the first frost of the year silvering the grounds, Charles came downstairs to find Anne and Robert in the kitchen. They were making biscuits, Mrs. Fielding's recipe, which Robert had memorized and Anne had transcribed in her careful hand and pinned to the wall beside the range. Robert was standing on a stool, pressing shapes into the dough, and Anne was beside him, one hand resting lightly on his back, not holding him, not guiding him, simply there, the way a wall is there, or a floor, or a thing you lean against without thinking because you trust it to hold. Robert looked up. "We are making tigers," he said. "I see that. Anne says tigers need more ginger. Anne is usually right about these things." Anne looked at Charles across the kitchen, over Robert's head with flour on her hands and the morning light catching the side of her face, and she smiled. Not the careful, considered smile she had given him in Granville's garden, but the unguarded one, the one that had built itself over months of worm rescues and biscuit making and the slow, patient work of earning a child's trust. "They do need more ginger," she said. "Your son has excellent instincts." Charles leaned against the doorframe and watched his wife and his son make tiger-shaped biscuits in the kitchen of the house that Elizabeth had built and Anne had learned to hold, and he thought about Granville's letter, come as a father with a boy who needs something you cannot give him, and he understood at last what it was that he could not give. Not a mother, not a replacement, not even love, although love had come, quiet and steady and unannounced, in the way that important things always arrived, without performance, without calculation, in the space between a woman kneeling in wet grass and a boy learning to trust again. What he could not give his son was the thing Anne had given him in the first 20 minutes, the knowledge that the world contained people who would get down on their knees beside you without being asked and help you carry what you could not carry alone. If this story stayed with you, you might find the next one does too. They arrive here, like a hand steadying a child who has lost his balance whenever they are ready.